Welcome to Mission Evolution Radio Show with Gwilda Wiyaka, bringing together today's leading experts to uncover ever-deepening spiritual truths and the latest scientific developments in support of the evolution of humankind. For more information on Mission Evolution Radio with Gwilda Wiyaka, visit www.missionevolution.org. And now, here's the host of Mission Evolution, Miss Gwilda Wiyaka.
We've all heard of codependency. What few of us may realize is the backed up rage often involved in being in a codependent relationship. How can the codependent find balance and still retain their big hearts? Mission Evolution Radio TV show is coming to you around the world on the X Zone Broadcast Network, xzbn.net. With us this hour to explore the enraged codependent is Michelle FARRIS. Michelle is a licensed psychotherapist, codependency expert, and course creator. She helps people create healthy relationships without sacrificing their big hearts. Michelle has written several ebooks and online courses in relationship skills. In her private practice, she provides practical tools to build self-trust and healthy relationships. Her website, counselingrecovery.com. Michelle, thank you for joining us on Mission Evolution.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
And this is a really important topic, particularly right now. So what brought you to specializing in codependency yourself?
Mainly because of my own codependency. I just found it fascinating. It's such a rabbit hole to go down, and it impacts so much of our lives that once I got into the personal work, I knew that that's what I wanted to do professionally.
It's amazing how sometimes our lives lead us to our profession, isn't it?
Yeah,
So,
for
so
sure.
let's start out all on the same foot. How would you define codependency?
So codependency is basically a relationship pattern where you hyper focus on other people and getting their love and support because you can't give it to yourself. Because codependent people tend to be over functioners in their relationships. So they're the ones who are the first to volunteer, to help, to cover for a coworker, because that's how they get their value, by doing 10 plus. Instead of being able to do their part, they overdo it, which really creates a lot of resentment and backlash in their relationships.
So what are the symptoms of codependency if we're kind of looking for it? Because it's a scale, isn't it? I mean, a lot of us are helpful and
Absolutely.
doers and this and that. And when does it tip over the other side of that scale?
That's such a good point. So you can be a giver and not be codependent if you can give with boundaries. So if I give to you, but I don't resent you, I'm good. But if I keep giving over and over, and on the back end, I'm resentful, feeling taken advantage of a lot, then I know it's probably bled into codependency. The other core symptom, oh, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
The other core symptom is an unhealthy dependency on others. So their mantra is you complete me. They can't be alone most of the time, which is why they get stuck in toxic relationships and can't leave, because they don't have that healthy sense of self or ability to have any moderation in their relationships. So boundaries are difficult. They tend to be people pleasers and chameleons. So if I think you're not going to like a certain part of me, I'm not going to show it. I'm going to show what I think you like in me versus being able to be myself, which is really a hard way to be in relationship. Because again, if we can't be authentic and we can't be ourselves, we are going to have a backlash of resentment and feeling invisible in our relationships.
So the people that are the chameleons, bless them,
Yeah.
aren't they usually fairly intuitive, be able to
Oh, yeah.
sense what the other person wants to see and then present that?
Yes. And they learn that in childhood, because part of what creates a codependent person is their needs and feelings and perceptions are not validated. So they learn another way to get love and support. And so they can take that emotional temperature of the room in their family and know when somebody's going to get upset or dad's going to rage. So they're really good at picking up on other people's feelings, but they're not good at picking up their own feelings.
So do they kind of have loss of identity in the process?
Oh, yes, for sure. Because again, when you hyper focus on others, right, you're really good at knowing what they need, but you're not paying attention to what you need. So in relationship, it all becomes about what you're doing and what you're giving to that other person, because that's how you find your value, versus asking yourself, well, what do I want? And what boundaries do I need to set in order for me to be comfortable? You're not even thinking that way because it's too threatening.
Children don't think that way to start out with. They have to be taught, don't they?
Right,
Okay.
right.
So how is very often this childhood tendency to start to building this chameleon-like approach to life?
Hmm.
Um, does that come from having, say, a narcissistic parent?
Oh, yeah. There's certain conditions that set codependency up. It's usually some level of dysfunction, whether it's a narcissistic parent or alcoholic parent. But usually it's any parenting that is inconsistent, or a parent is emotionally unavailable. Because let's face it, when we have a baby, nobody gets the rule book, right? We don't really know how to do it. So we end up doing either the same thing that was done to us, or we choose to do the polar opposite, which isn't necessarily healthy. So if the child doesn't get their perceptions and their opinions and their feelings validated and worked through and encouraged, then they're going to learn to be someone else, and they're going to hide their true feelings because it's not safe to express it. That, kids should be seen and not heard mentality is really part of what sets up codependency.
So, in addition, does a child even actually lose? They never really develop a sense of self and a sense of
Right,
what they
right.
feel or what they need because it's set on the back burner so much. Yes.
Yeah, no, they definitely don't.
So, if a child comes out of that kind of a situation, is that
Hmm.
what you mentioned earlier? The other side of codependency is not having an identity of your own, not being okay
Yes,
being alone because they have nothing to emulate, nothing to reflect back to.
right, right.
Um, and how do you break that up? Sounds like a trap.
Yeah, well, I think in any recovery process, you have to be sick and tired of doing the same thing, expecting different results. I mean, really, it's the same process. You have to hit that wall of, you know what, I can't keep doing this. And unfortunately, codependent people get a lot of kudos for overfunctioning. At work, they get promotions sometimes. Uh, they're the person at church that everybody says, oh, that person is a lifesaver. They help me out so much. So it really takes a lot for the codependent person to realize, hey, this is not working, because they get so much positive feedback from overgiving. But what they don't get is they don't get to be seen and heard. So they really do feel invisible in their relationships because they're really playing a role that may be part of them, but not all of them, because we all hit our limit in relationships and sometimes want to say no. But if you can't do that, then you really end up feeling trapped. So that loss of self really continues until usually it's a relationship that makes somebody hit bottom, where they say, I'm in so much pain, I can't keep attracting the same type of person, especially if they're narcissistic. That leads them down a lot of pain and recovery, though.
Isn't a excuse me, but isn't a codependent deceptive in a certain way? So they show what they
Hmm.
think you want to see, or they intuit you want to see, rather than themselves. But then again, they're selling you a bill of goods, aren't they?
They are, but I don't think they're doing it purposely. I know I didn't. I was just trying to be loved when I was in my codependency. And I think that there is an innocence to that, because they literally are just trying to find love. And it's just really hard because they have to realize, like what you said, in recovery, they have to realize, hey, I am actually pretending here. I am pretending not to be someone that I'm really not. And that's where they have to realize that they have to want to be themselves and to go down that road of being imperfect, because codependent people really strive to be perfect and never make mistakes, because they think if they make a mistake, then people will either get mad at them, which is super threatening, or they will leave them, which is even more threatening.
Right? Those abandonment issues always come back to haunt you, don't they?
Yeah.
Codependency is a term that's used a lot.
Hmm.
What are the pitfalls of a layperson labeling somebody codependent? It seems like it's a buzzword right now.
Right. Well, yeah, if you really have to look at people who are doing this work and read articles, read books, find the definition that really fits you, because that's the trap in codependency. Is somebody can say, oh, you're codependent because you give too much or you never say no. And that may be a part of codependency, but to really relate to codependency, there's a lot of different symptoms. And so that's where we can use that buzzword, but it's really not fair because it may or may not apply. And the other aspect of codependency is you brought this up in the beginning, is it is on a continuum. You can have some symptoms, you can have a moderate amount of symptoms, and you can be severely codependent. So most lay people aren't really going to understand the depth and the issues and the trauma that surround codependency.
So, in other words, if you're going to take a codependency diagnosis, make sure it came from a professional. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And today there's so many good articles and books about it. You can read up and find it yourself. But yeah, that catchphrase can be dangerous.
Well, there's a lot of misinformation on the internet too.
Yeah,
How do
yeah,
you know
that's
when you're
true.
getting good information or when you're not?
That's true. You have to go to the experts because you have to find sources that are talking about it regularly, not just a one-off article, but people who really understand this because it's not necessarily a personality disorder. It's not in the DSM yet, but it is a very important issue that affects our relationships and our self-esteem.
In our lives, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. We're about out of time in this segment, but is codependency restricted to romantic relationships? I mean, we always hear about it there, but is it restricted to
Yeah.
romantic relationships?
No, you can have a friendship. You can definitely do this with your child, whether they're little or an adult, because it's really about getting your needs and your fulfillment met by someone else, not by yourself. So you can do that with anybody.
The one thing I'd like to, like I said, we're about out of time in this segment. But one thing I'd like to pick up on is the relationship between a codependent parent and the child and the results of that. I think that's pretty fascinating, and I think that it's going on more than we know. Don't you? Do you work with that at all?
Oh, yeah. I mean, in my neighborhood, the grammar school my son went to, everybody was about the grades and getting straight A's, and the parents were so into that. But the problem is what happens when your kid isn't in that box? Can you let go and say, you know what, my kid has other gifts, and to not attach your kid's success or failure to who you are as a person, because that's where it bleeds into codependency.
Gotcha. Well, it is that magic moment for a station break. Michelle and I will return very shortly, so don't go away. This is Mission Evolution, www.missionevolution.org. If you're codependent, would you know it? This is this hour discussing the many facets of codependency is licensed psychotherapist and codependency expert Michelle Farris. Her website, counselingrecovery.com. Michelle, we spoke about how codependents tend to not even know who they are because they're busy being a chameleon to,
Mhm.
earn the kudos that they think they need in their life. If we don't know who we are, how can we tell if we're codependent? How can we tell if we're not being authentic?
I think most people who struggle with codependency or any other mental health issue know intuitively something's wrong, because when you're codependent, it doesn't feel good. You don't feel calm. You don't feel centered. You feel like you're chasing love. You're chasing that approval, and that doesn't feel good. So I think that, and because codependent people are feelers, even though they're not great at naming their own feelings, they certainly are still experiencing them. So I think that they do know on some level that something's not right. But often what the codependent will do is they will say, well, it's my relationship that's not working. I just need to find another boyfriend. I just need to find another friend. And that's going to fix me, versus realizing that it's a pattern that we've actually started and set in motion in our relationships.
So that projection piece, if he would just do this, then I would be okay. That kind of stuff.
Well, yeah, because codependent people tend to attract takers, people who are alcoholic or narcissistic or just in some ways more self-centered. Because if we're the overgiver, we're going to attract the person who's the undergiver. That's the balance, and that's the dysfunctional balance. So it's pretty easy to point the finger at them but we're missing the boat because we're not realizing we're a part of that equation.
And isn't it easier just public wise? I mean, she's such a sweetheart. What's she doing
Yes.
married to that
Yes.
guy? When
Oh,
she
yeah.
set him up for it without knowing it.
Right. Well, that's part of the reason why codependent people don't get help because they look good. They say to themselves, I'm not the one drinking. I'm not the one gaslighting. They're hurting me. So it's really hard for them to see because their behaviors look so nice and giving and generous that they kind of miss that they're overdoing it.
If the person that they're with has a tendency to be self-centered anyway, if they
Mhm.
don't sense any boundaries in the other person, do they then carry it further and further and further as the relationship goes on?
You mean, does the codependent carry it further
No, does the
or the other person?
the
Oh,
partner, do they
yes.
get less and less and less considerate of the codependent?
Yeah, because what we end up doing, and I think this happens in any relationship, is we train the other person how to treat us. If I am never going to say yes to you and I am going to be there for you, even if it hurts me, then the other person learns to accept that and go, oh, wow, this gets all be about me. I can keep asking over and over, and I can even ask more because that other person is never saying no. So, what may start off as a less codependent relationship may grow and grow and grow into being more and more toxic because when you're not setting any boundaries, that other person learns, hey, I can push the envelope until I get everything I want. Now, not every relationship is going to go to that extreme, but that is the danger of codependency and not catching it when we're not taking care of ourselves.
Well, you mentioned earlier in the first segment that the codependent might be selling a bill of goods, but they're innocent about it. Can't the other side of that equation be innocent? They just don't feel any boundaries, so they just go on about their life and tromp all over the other person unwittingly.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think really these behaviors are learned, and we can demonize the other side, the person that's taking, but they've learned that growing up too, just like the codependent has. So, I mean, a narcissist is another beast. That is not a person who generally gets help, and there really isn't a great success rate for that because the narcissist assumes that they're right and they do not have the problem. So it's really difficult there. But I think that if we're not talking about that and we're talking about somebody who has toxic behaviors, they grew up with those toxic behaviors. They learned them just like the codependent learned to shut down and please others. So in essence, you know, I don't believe anybody really chooses their behavior. They end up becoming that way over several year period in their childhood, and then by the time they're adults they realize, oh my gosh, this is not working anymore, and that's the opportunity to get help.
So let's talk about children as promised. One thing that I've observed as a layperson, mind you,
Hmm.
is that sometimes somebody that's admittedly a codependent person, when they're dealing with their children, they are on top of the child to the point that they tell the
Yeah.
child how they feel. Tell the child what they should do. They
Mm,
try to pave the way for the child, just the same behavior that you would
yeah.
see in a love relationship. And how does that impact the children?
Well, the child usually grows up anxious and codependent because if the parent can't tolerate the child being separate or the child not succeeding or the child having difficult feelings, because usually that's what's happening is the parent can't tolerate someone else having pain or let's face it, we don't learn how to be a parent, like I said. So we may see our child as the threat because if they're unhappy, that means we're doing a bad job. So the child grows up and says, I have to become this other thing to get love and approval. So I have to deny certain parts of me. Maybe I'm being told I'm being too sensitive, so I'm going to shut down my feelings, or I have to be a straight A student because that's what my family values. There's a lot of pressure on these kids because if the parent can't let go and realize that they are separate and the child personality and successes and failures are not a reflection of their parenting, then, the parenting relationship can be somewhat healthy. But when there's that enmeshment, and you have to succeed in order for me to look good, that's a lot of pressure on a child. And they typically have a lot of issues of, anxiety, depression, eating disorders, things like that, because they have to learn a dysfunctional way to cope.
Are Do codependent people tend to be hypervigilant and always under a
Oh,
lot of
yes.
stress?
Yes. Like I said earlier, they take the emotional temperature of any room. So they'll go to a party and they will be able to spot the people who are upset, people who might be attractive to them. Like maybe if they attract alcoholics, they'll say, yep, I'll find one in every room because their radar is built for it. So again, that can be a good quality where we can hone that skill and say, ooh, that person feels toxic to me. I'm not going to go over there. Right? That's the good part of it. That's what we want to cultivate, is that ability to look at your intuition and those feelings and use them to attract healthier people and avoid the people who aren't going to be healthy for you. Because, in essence, that can be a strength.
All of our traits can if we take a hold of them, can't they?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
If
we
they're
get
in
control there.
moderation, for sure.
Exactly. So, if a codependent, do they tend to also draw that type of personality that their parents were, like in an attempt to fix
Mhm.
it? Like, this is my job?
Yeah, I don't think they set out to, we're not gonna a lot of people aren't gonna say, "I'm gonna go get an alcoholic just like my dad."
No.
But your point is right on, is that unconsciously that's what we do because that's what's familiar. That's why a lot of people may say, "Well, I didn't really like that person, they were boring." Well, probably because healthy is boring, and if it doesn't ring a familiar tone to them back to their childhood, because our parents are our template for who we pick in a relationship. Even if we pick the opposite, there's still a thread of the same level of dysfunction. So it's really important to be aware of that.
How long does it take a person to start recognizing the very thing that you're talking about? That, oh, I'm attracted to this person, not because I'm attracted to this person, but because it's just like the relationship my parents had. Therefore, it's familiar. How long does it take us to start catching ourselves?
Yeah, I think that varies from person to person, but usually if you're in the recovery process, it may take a few years to get to that deeper level of family of origin work, because the codependent person typically is hyper focused on fixing their relationship because that's where they think they're going to heal, versus looking at the patterns and the childhood wounds that have actually set those behaviors in motion.
So back to the, if I can get this person into counseling with me and he could just get it right, then
Yes.
we would be. Yeah, gotcha. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's so common.
So we've talked about what causes a person to become codependent. And oftentimes
Mhm.
we think of codependent codependency as related to substance abuse, but is that always the
Mhm.
case?
No, but that was the first vein that got public attention, is the codependent, the enabler, and the alcoholic. So the alcoholic person attracted the person who would end up making excuses for them, making sure that they were being taken care of, bought their liquor for them, all, a lot of series of enabling dysfunctional behaviors that didn't work. But soon after that, I think that was in the 70s when that really came up. But as it became the 80s and 90s, people were starting to realize that codependency was like a tree with many branches. It just impacted everything. It wasn't just alcoholic relationships, it was relationships with your kids, with spouses, with narcissists, a lot of different patterns of relationship. It was much more of a widespread problem than originally thought.
What are some of the symptoms of enabling?
Preventing somebody else's consequences. That's probably the
Mm.
biggest one, where if I see you're hurting, I'm going to do something to prevent that from happening. And the reason the codependent does that is because they can't tolerate seeing someone else in pain because it triggers their own pain. So I will make that call to your boss and say that you're sick. I will do the chores and your daily errands to make life easier in hopes that you won't drink. So there's a lot of things that basically enabling can be seen as you doing for others what they should be able to do for themselves.
So there's a lot of um, hidden agenda, really, in being codependent as well, isn't there? It might not be stated, but oh, I can take care of that
Hmm.
for you. But then behind all that is and then you'll be sober, and then we'll be okay, and then. Is that
Yeah, well,
present in most all codependents, or just a few?
no, it can. I mean, definitely the codependent person has a lot of unrealistic expectations, but it's also the agreement in the relationship where the alcoholic or the other person agrees that, yeah, you know what, you're going to fix me and then I'm going to blame you, and that's going to be our dance. So it really is something that becomes a relationship pattern uh, more than anything else.
And it's a pretty sad one too, isn't it? And round we go. Nobody's being who they are, right?
Right, right.
Yeah. Yeah, very difficult that. And then it's so easy to lose yourself in it. Do you see, we're out of time in this segment, but on the other side, I'm going to ask you, do you see people coming out of it? I mean, it's so complex.
Oh, yes, definitely.
So Michelle and I will be right back to continue our discussion. Please stay right there. This is Mission Evolution, www.missionevolution.org. Does it take two to play the codependency game? This is Mission Evolution, missionevolution.org. With us discussing the hidden aspects of codependency is Michelle Farris. Her website, counselingrecovery.com. Michelle, it seems like so far we've talked about a lot of the compensatory things people can do to, stop themselves before they, go across the room to the alcoholic versus somebody that's boring. Um, but it seems like even Al-Anon, okay, is compensatory skills being taught. Is there really such a thing as truly recovering from being a codependent, or is it always going to be behavior modification?
Oh, no, I think you can actually definitely be recovering. I just don't say people can be fully recovered. This isn't something that I can say, I have no codependent tendencies at all after 30 years. There's no way. I still have them. But you can get to the point where you have healthier relationships, you are taking care of yourself, and you do trust yourself. So that's what recovery really is about.
So again, it's still kind of you have to always be right on top of yourself because it's going to be your default setting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, yeah, it takes a lot of work. And I think any personal growth, you have to be diligent. You can't just say, okay, I'm going to do 2 years of therapy and then I'm done, because then the behaviors end up coming back if we don't practice healthy habits on a daily or, somewhat regular basis.
So how effective is couples counseling when you have a codependent and
Mm.
alcoholic or a codependent and a narcissist? How effective is
Uh-huh.
that? Or are we looking at throwing in the towel?
Oh, no, I think couples counseling and individual counseling can be very helpful. With a narcissist, I would say probably not. I would definitely recommend more the person who has the codependency to have their own work done, because the work is going to be more around assessing that relationship and how to leave it so that it doesn't impact you to that degree. But the codependent and alcoholic, absolutely, they can benefit from couples therapy if they have a therapist that is well versed in those issues. You have to always make sure you are working with someone who understands what you're dealing with, because not every therapist does. And if you pick somebody who says, oh, sure, I work with that, but they really don't, that's not necessarily going to be the best outcome. But the codependent person really needs to do their own work, because the alcoholic, the toxic person, the other person they're in relationship with, really that's where they don't have control. But to fix these tendencies, the codependent person really needs to do their own individual work.
So basically, it goes right back to it all starts in here. You can't fix it out there.
Yeah, I mean, you can certainly do some of the relationship counseling. I'm not going to say that can't be impactful, because it can. Because sometimes, even if, say, the drinker continues to drink, you can, well, couples therapy is not going to be very effective at that point, but you can talk about things and you can set boundaries and say, okay, because you're choosing to drink, this is what I'm going to do and when I'm going to choose in and out. And having those discussions may be helpful, but it's pretty limited when the alcoholic is still drinking.
Right. We've been talking so far about either alcoholic or codependent, okay? But are sometimes alcoholics codependents?
Yes. Underneath a lot of people who have addictions, including alcohol, can be a base of codependency. But usually the codependency isn't obvious because the alcoholic personality is the bigger umbrella that to be seen. But usually, if somebody gets sober, say 5 years, that's when their relationship issues start to come up and they start to realize that they may have codependent tendencies from childhood.
That they've been medicating away with the alcohol.
Yes. Yes.
Gotcha. Okay. Okay. Um, so, what's the shadow side of codependency? I mean, they look good, okay? They
Yeah.
function well, but what's the shadow side? What goes on
They
underneath?
often they often feel alone. They feel misunderstood. They feel taken advantage of. They feel resentful. A lot of times that shadow self is angry because on the outside they appear very nice and flexible and accommodating, but inside, after a while, they reach their limit and they're in that war with themselves about, I want, but I can't let myself want. So it's that struggle that becomes harder and harder over time.
What about the anger that starts to build up?
Mhm.
And they tend to stuff it. So then, do they
Right.
become rageful? I mean, it's like they're full of rage, and it starts to bleed out into their life and their relationships.
They can be. Most codependent people are not gonna relate to anger or rage initially, but they're really good at stuffing, and the reason that's the case is because they are people pleasers, so they're gonna if they think somebody's gonna get upset, they will choke down that feeling and not say anything. But their anger tends to build slowly over time, and then they will either be passive aggressive, or eventually they may have a rageful moment. It's typically not, it doesn't happen a lot, but that's sometimes what gets the codependent to seek help is that they actually finally lose it on their child, on their mate, and they're so ashamed that it actually makes them seek help because most of the time codependent people are not necessarily rageful, but if they are, it actually takes them by surprise because they're very focused on hiding those feelings.
So you mentioned that they become passive aggressive. For those of us that
Mhm.
don't have a psychology background, would
Yes.
you please tell us what is passive aggressive? What's it look like?
So it's basically when your anger comes out in an indirect, unhealthy way. So if you ask me a favor and I say, well, of course, don't I always help you? The words say yes, but my tone says I'm mad. So the passive aggressive is that indirect jab that is very confusing. It's also a form of gaslighting, and gaslighting is when you basically deny somebody else's reality. And that's what passive aggressive behavior is like. It's giving the silent treatment. I'm not going to talk to you for a week, or I'm going to say a really sarcastic comment that is confusing because on the one hand I'm trying to be funny, but on the other hand I'm really being hurtful by saying something like, well, of course I'm going to help you, don't I always? That's pretty passive aggressive because I'm saying I'm going to help, but my tone is I don't want to help, and I'm not
My tone
owning
is I
that.
do it all the time and I'm sick of it.
That's
but,
right.
but that's not what they're
That's right.
saying. Right. Okay.
Right. So
Um,
it's a very indirect way.
when a passive aggressive, when a codependent becomes passive
Mhm.
aggressive, do they get any hints themselves that that's what's going on?
They know the undercurrent of stress and being taken advantage of. That's what the codependent is trying to hold on to. Like, okay, I just got to suppress this. I got to keep this under control because if I express it, they're not going to like it and they could possibly leave. So they're constantly wrestling with those feelings of stress. So I think they do know that that feeling taken advantage of, resentful, they may not name it, but they definitely feel it. But what surprises them is that they think they can control it until one more thing happens. Maybe their partner does one more thing, and all of a sudden, poof, they started screaming, and they realize, oh my God, it really isn't about what just happened or what was just said. But it takes them by surprise because they're trying so hard to control those feelings.
So, from what you're saying, the stress starts to build, and then later
Yes,
on in a relationship, the poor selfish person gets blindsided by all of a
yeah,
sudden,
they do.
my
They
partner
do.
grew fangs. What was this about? What did I do? This is the
Right.
way we've done it all along. What's wrong? If you
Right.
get into that kind of a situation, what do you do?
For the codependent person,
Hmm.
well, I think they usually end up being quite shocked at their own behavior. And that's really the sign that tells you need help. It's time to seek therapy. It's time to join Al Anon or Coda. Do something because you're not wrong for that anger. That's the problem is most people, especially when it comes to anger, they think they're bad or wrong if they've screamed, if they've done something destructive. But really at the heart of it, even though yes, it's not it's a dysfunctional behavior to do unhealthy anger, but at the core of that is a need. And a desire to say, you know what, something isn't okay with me and it needs to change. And that's what the codependent person needs to realize is that their anger isn't just because, it's not because they're a bad person, it's because something isn't okay and it needs to be addressed.
What about the person that is the unwitting recipient of all of this sudden rage?
Mhm.
What's your advice for them?
I would share how it makes you feel. Wow, you know what? When you yell at me like that, I feel disrespected. I feel really hurt. And really part of where couples and people go wrong when it comes to anger is that they point fingers. Don't you talk to me like that, right? And then you're off and running versus, whoa, I need to tell that other person this is how it's impacting me. And if it's not corrected or, they come back with an even more toxic response, I'm going to need to leave and excuse myself because staying in that situation expecting the other person to hear you may not be realistic.
Absolutely. So when do you know that the anger is to a point that you really kind of need to
Mhm.
get intervention?
Well, usually you're saying things that are hurtful and you're crossing that line. So, usually, most of us, when we're angry, right, we start off, we're frustrated, we're talking about our upset, but there's usually a line that's crossed where, okay, now I'm starting to get into saying hurtful things. Now I'm starting to get mean. Now I'm starting to yell. Most of us, if you're paying attention, know that your temperature is rising emotionally. It's not just that you're angry, you're now using it as ammunition to hurt the other person. And that's what we need to stop is be able to identify, oh, I'm crossing that line and I need to do something different because expressing anger can be a healthy thing.
It's necessary, isn't it? We're about out of time in this segment, but what is anger for? Obviously, it has a purpose there.
It does. It helps us recognize when somebody crosses our boundaries or does something that upsets us. And that's
And
the value.
when we get triggered into anger,
Mhm.
is it important to ascertain where it's really coming from?
Yes, absolutely it is. Because often we may think it's about what's currently happening. And sometimes there's a percentage, right? It's always about some aspect of what's happening in the present time. But usually, if it's a trigger or if it's a really big, intense emotional response, there's a history to it that we need to get to.
And it may not even be with the person we're yelling at, right?
Yes.
In fact, how many
Well
times
said.
is it not?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Most of the time, it's not.
Oh man, how do we ever get to it when we don't even yell at the right person, huh?
I know.
Well, it is time for another station break. Please stay with us as Michelle and I continue to explore codependency. This is Mission Evolution, www.missionevolution.org. What is the enraged codependent? This is Mission Evolution, missionevolution.org. We're continuing our discussion with Michelle Farris. Her website, counselingrecovery.com. Michelle, do codependent people tend to micromanage other people's lives?
Some do. Some do. There might be For me, there's different styles of codependency. There's the person who's the people pleaser and acquiesces to everyone, never has a voice, never expresses a difference of opinion. And then there's the controller. That's the one that will micromanage and tell you what to do and say when, you're not okay because you're not doing it my way. So they think they're being helpful by having all the answers.
So what makes them feel like they need to have all the answers and not let the other person find their own answers?
Well, part of control is it's the illusion of being safe. So as a child, they probably maybe they took care of their siblings. They solved problems for their parents. They were the parents' mediator or confidant. So they learn early on that them having the answers is actually what gets them love and approval. So these behaviors go back a long way. That's why, it really depends on what type of style somebody has in their codependency.
Oftentimes, micromanaging people are very uptight about it, like their life depends on the other guy doing what they say.
Right.
Does that come from someone that has had to manage the environment to prevent violence
Mhm.
or anything?
Yeah, I think a lot of times control comes from a lack of safety, where we feel like we have to control what's happening currently because that's the only way we're going to stay safe. Because as children, if we grow up in alcoholism and rage with narcissistic parents, we don't feel safe a lot of the time, and there's not any validation for our experience. So you kind of get a double whammy of the dysfunction in the family and the lack of validation of that experience, because that's what can be really crazy making for children.
We've been talking about how the environment that a child grows up in can really set them up to be codependent.
Mhm.
Does does that environment oftentimes normalize the very that, well, that's just the way it is, daddy drinks,
Yes.
mama takes care of things. Does that normalize it so that's what they actually are thinking is normal in a relationship?
Yeah. And that's why they go when they seek out relationships in adulthood, they attract toxic people or dysfunctional people that are similar. Because again, if you don't get raised with healthy habits, with healthy relationship patterns, then you're not going to see that. You're not going to even think of it. So you're going to assume that all relationships might be with takers or where you can't have a voice or conflict means violence. All of those things get set up for 18 years of childhood. So it's really tough to be able to go out in the world and create a healthy relationship because your template is from childhood.
It's even I would expect it's even difficult to recognize when you're in a healthy one if you have no other model.
Right. Right. And usually that's where the pain becomes your greatest motivator because as adults, it gets worse over time without recovery.
Mm, yeah, and it's exhausting, isn't it?
Yes. Yes.
There's another thing I was wondering about codependency is that we were saying that codependents tend to be very intuitive. They've learned to really hone their
Hmm.
intuition to stay safe and to
Yes.
function as they do. Does there come a situation where the codependent person ends up being the emotional regulator for the one that's not codependent, for the one that they're having an unhealthy, imbalanced relationship with? Feel the other person's
You
feelings,
know,
express the other
oh yeah,
person's
they
feelings?
definitely feel the other person's feelings, but I would say in a codependent relationship, usually the person they're codependent with, that's the one that's the primary focus. So the codependent person is going to focus more on their emotions, not
That's what I mean. Yeah, that
their
they're
own. Yeah,
processing the
for
other
sure.
person's emotions rather
Yes.
than their own.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and this is very similar to parenting, where they want to fix their partner or their child's emotions or anxiety or any other difficult feeling because it threatens them and it triggers their own pain.
So that's why they become so desperate and controlling is because they're being triggered into their own
Yes.
pain. Okay,
Yes.
that makes sense to me. That makes sense to
Yeah.
me. Um, we were talking about how anger can be a good thing. And
Mhm.
and I've seen people that, have been codependent and they haven't shown any anger for, 30, 40 years of their life. And then that last nerve
Yep.
gets hit, right? And then they just lose it. Um, but it also, if you go from not getting angry ever, and then you
Mhm.
start trying to recognize how you feel and manage it, doesn't sometimes people go the opposite direction for a while?
Yes.
And what's that look
Yes.
like, and how do you come back from it?
So when the lid gets opened, right, and the codependent person actually starts having their anger, they will tend to have it in at the other extreme because we're stuffing it or uh-oh, now I can't control it. So part of the deal with anger is anger management's about identifying the feelings early. That's really the simplest way to describe it. Because if a person can assess their upset early, and what I like to do is I do a 1 to 10 scale. 1 is very little stress, you're really good. 10 is you're enraged. What we want to do is we want to catch it at that 3, 4. We're starting to get upset, but we need to do something about it. Instead of choosing to ignore it and say, it's not that bad yet, I'll just keep going. And then you get home and it's a 5, 6 and climbs from there. You're really able to hone in and say, okay, wait a minute. What am I feeling? How can I manage this now? Because it's going to be much easier to manage your emotions when they're 3, 4 than when they're an 8, 9, 10.
And the top is blown off your head, right?
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
at that point, your only choice is to leave.
Right, right. So it's that time in the program, Michelle, when I get to ask you, what's your mission?
Oh, my mission is to help people create healthy relationships without sacrificing themselves in the process.
Oh, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. So needed. My goodness, so needed. Um, what are some of the tools? Oh, I know what I was going
Mhm.
to ask you. Is where does grief fit in here? Is grief behind the rage? Is there
Mm.
grief involved in this whole process?
There can be grief, absolutely, in the recovery process with codependency because there's the denial of who you are and the losses you've experienced, especially in childhood where we don't let ourselves feel that pain. So, part of recovery is working on the family of origin issues. And that's when you go back and you actually look at what are those experiences that set you up for codependency that need to be grieved, like the parents you didn't get, the childhood you didn't get. Sometimes kids grow up and they're adults at age 6, right? So they have to grieve that they were never allowed to be kids or they never got their birthday celebrated. There's things like that that we can't get back that need to be grieved.
How can you tell when grief is a part of the issue that you're dealing with? Because don't they stuff grief as well as anger?
Yeah. Well, you can tell because any potential loss of a relationship is going to trigger that grief. So instead of saying to yourself, oh my gosh, I'm really upset that my partner and I might break up, it's I can't live without this partner. I am going to do whatever I can to stay in that relationship, even if I hurt myself, because I can't stand the pain behind it. Because that lower level of grief in the background from our childhood is going to come up when we feel current losses because that grief has to come up to be healed. And that takes a significant amount of time to do the grief work.
I would imagine. So one of the things I would imagine that a person would have to grieve is I've just lived 40 years without ever knowing or honoring
Yeah,
who I am.
yeah,
What would I have
yeah.
been otherwise? How do you start to reconcile that?
That's a hard one because part of it is just being honest in what you just said. Oh my gosh, I have let myself stay in toxic relationships for 40 years. There is going to be a sadness and an anger that is legitimate that needs to be processed and felt. But really, when you have enough support in your recovery process, which means peer support like 12-step groups, individual support, whether that's a therapist or a coach, principles you can work on in your daily life, then it becomes easier to go through that process of grief and anger and come out the other side and actually forgive yourself. Because, nobody sets out to be a codependent. Nobody sets out to ruin their lives. We do the best we can because we don't know another way. And that compassion needs to be part of that healing process. But at first, yeah, the grief and the anger may be the first part to show up.
When a person is starting on this recovery path,
Hmm.
Is one of the difficult things to get over, and if it is, how do you get over it? The fact that it's worked. Like you say, you get approval. People like you. You're the good guy in the
Yeah,
relationship.
yeah.
Um, how difficult is that to get over, and how
Mhm.
important is it to get over in order to heal?
Well, I think people need to realize they can still give. I'm still a huge giver, but I also know where my limit is and I don't cross it anymore. Whereas before, I would just give, 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 and I'd be super resentful on the back end. So I think that's part of the relief that I wish somebody had told me when I started my recovery is that you can still give, because there is that mentality of, oh, maybe now I can't give at all. And that's not the case. You just need to do it in a way that doesn't hurt you.
And that is the tendency, though, isn't it, to go from being overgiving to where you're absolutely dry. Um,
Right.
like the
Right.
saying, if you don't want someone to suck you dry, quit giving them the straw. To to the other side, where you just absolutely shut down your heart and you don't give anything to
Yes.
anybody. How can you tell you've gone the other direction, and how do you correct from that?
Well, you've gone to that other extreme when you probably feel stuck, like, nope, I'm not doing a thing. And you're probably angry and you're probably holding on really tight. But that's not, again, that can be the pendulum that swings to the other direction for a while. And that's okay. That can be part of recovery. But eventually that's going to be too uncomfortable. And you're going to realize that, wait a minute, I can't live my life walling myself off. That doesn't usually last very long for the codependent person, unless they're now thinking that's the only solution. Usually they come and realize, wait a minute, you know what, I need to have relationship, I need that connection, I need to find a more functional way to be in relationship. And that's where the recovery process absolutely needs to include other people, because we can't do it on our own. It's way too hard of a process. And our codependent brain is going to reinforce those behaviors, not know what the new behaviors look like.
There's no reference point, is there?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, we're just about out of time altogether. But Michelle, what's a good way to find balance and still retain your big heart?
Mm. Well, find the things you want to give that make you feel good and that honor who you are, and take baby steps to start saying no. Because You know, the baby steps still matter, even if it's, I don't want to go to that restaurant, or can we see a different movie? Something small so that you can start to gain confidence in saying no and setting those boundaries.
Well, it is that time. Michelle, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you.
The guest this hour has been Michelle Farris. Michelle is a licensed psychotherapist, codependency expert, and course creator. To find out more about Michelle, her classes, and all she has to offer, visit her website, counselingrecovery.com. This has been Mission Evolution with Gwilda Wiyaka. For more information or to enjoy past archived episodes, visit missionevolution.org. But please join us right here next time, as this mission continues, bringing information, resources, and support to our evolving world.